All right. Why don't we go ahead and get started, and we'll let the rest come in when they get here. So, hi everybody. You all know this, but I'm Rod. For anybody watching this later, and we're pretty excited to have a very special guest tonight. I think we're going to discover just how special he is. Paul VanderKlay. Welcome, Paul.
It's good to be here. This is a lot of fun. Rod and I talked about the genesis of this group, so it's really been fun to sort of watch it do its thing.
Yeah, so the backstory is actually a pretty good one. So Nuance Forum is built on the idea of facilitating meaningful conversations about the most consequential aspects of modern life, to genuinely get to the heart of the matter. And it was years ago that I was first kind of, noodling on this idea. And I've got a lot of ideas and I don't get to most of them. So the chances of it actually happening were low, but I've been thinking about it for a long time. And then in early 2017, along comes this guy named Jordan Peterson. And so I didn't realize how many of us there were. For me, I felt like I discovered him. And I was like, well, this is interesting. And so I just sort of started watching as a kind of a keen observer, and the effect it had on me is it sort of confirmed, like, oh, maybe there's a lot of people who want to have conversations like this. Maybe it's not just me. And so I was watching his lectures and videos, and then a little bit later that year, I get fed up through the algorithms. There's a video that says something like Pastor, I forget exactly what the title was, Paul, but Pastor Jordan Peterson, you were wise to put Jordan Peterson in the heading. And so I'm watching this Christian pastor talk about this phenomenon called Jordan Peterson. And so I was immediately hooked and watched a few videos, and it wasn't very long. It was a few videos in where I don't know if you made a reference to it or it was a comment in this, I forget, but the word Whitensville came up. And I'm like, wait a minute, like, who knows where Whitensville is? Whitensville was a little town in Massachusetts where my father was born and raised, the oldest of 8 kids. And we have since discovered, we're pretty sure that Paul's mother and my father went to school together. It's that small a town. It would have been, I guess, secondary school, because she probably went to the Christian Reform school before that. But so I decided, well, this is just too, you might call it Providence. So I'll just reach out, and I think the heading of my email was Whitensville. And so I just introduced myself and said, I've just been kind of noodling on this idea and really found your work interesting. And so we started corresponding here and there. And Paul, when you started a meetup, as soon as it was practical, I was traveling back and forth to California a lot. So I made a point of stopping in and visiting one of your meetups. And while I was there, I attended one of your services. And so a friendship blossomed. And so I have been a keen observer. And of course, it wouldn't be right to not complete the story by saying that you must have mentioned this little project buried in the middle of a 90-minute video back in the early part of, I guess it was this year. And I remember because I was at the airport in Las Vegas, and I'm seeing people RSVP for this meetup we had scheduled, and all of a sudden we had one a week or two later, and there's like a half a dozen new people. Like, who are these people? And they had literally Googled it and found us, and like they've gone to some trouble, and some of them are on here tonight. So in a sense, you have every right to claim a little bit of authorship for what we have been trying to create here as well. So we're really excited to have you here. So I guess I'll get us started I'll just sort of open us up with some kind of opening questions, and I'm sure lots of other people will want to chime in. So I guess so here's a Christian pastor who, you're not just talking about Jordan Peterson, you're talking about all sorts of other philosophers. You're sort of fully engaged in what has come to be known the meaning crisis, the intellectual dark web, at least such as it was when it was. You're taking these people seriously and really taking them seriously and probing what they're thinking and the positions they're taking. And then along comes, it turns out a lot of people did what I did, which is they reached out to you. So you find out all these people want to talk to you. And so then you start just talking to anybody basically who wants to talk to you. And they have all kinds of questions, the kind of questions probably that a lot of people have for pastors. The difference is you're not in the privacy of your consultation room. You're entertaining these questions, taking all comers, and putting it out on the internet if they're game. And this, it's one of those things that kind of goes without saying, but it needs to be said. This is a remarkable quality. This is not something that most people think of when they think of a pastor. So it brings a question to mind for me, and I kind of already know what the short answer is. So I'm actually more interested in the long answer, which is something like, "What are you up to?" And the short answer, you're going to say, "Well, you're not sure either," and fair enough, right? But to the extent that anyone can know such a thing, what do you feel like is your project? What are you up to?
I think I'm up to what everyone is up to, and that we want to know the truth about the world. We want to know where we fit in. We want to know that what we think and do is significant, and about the only way we're going to figure that out is by talking to other people. And for a long time, so Christianity, especially in a small denomination like the Christian Reformed Church, can be a very insular, isolated thing. And just by virtue of where I grew up and my father and the ministry there, and just my experiences being a pastor of a small church in a very cosmopolitan, middle-sized city, I began to notice that some of the differences between what I see happening in church and out in the larger culture aren't that different. And by some modulation of language, I think we can understand each other better. And if we do, maybe we can have better conversations, and maybe people's lives can be better. Now, of course, as a Christian minister, I think part of that involves religious commitments and the shape of those things. But I also don't think you can just sort of talk people into those things. And so I like having conversations. And I actually was just a colleague of mine, just because of COVID and because we have so much space here. He just put an office in one of our rooms. And so he's dealing with a bunch of my homeless friends. And he left his car this morning, and the guy came up to him and started talking, and he thought, yeah, he's already repeated himself from the only 3 conversations I've had with him. How much time can I spend talking to this homeless guy? A lot. And on one hand, you think, yeah, people are repetitive. People don't have that much to say. Everyone says the same thing. But if you can sort of wade through and gently coax people, not only can you learn more about them, but they can learn more about themselves. And so that's sort of what I'm doing. And just this afternoon, someone direct messaged me on Twitter. He's a physicist who is a Christian, and he's trying to write a children's book that isn't particularly Christian, but it sort of gets at the emanation emergence issues that I've been talking about with Vervaeke and J.P. Marceau and Jonathan Pageau. And he wanted me to read his children's book and give him critique. It's like, that's sort of wild. And so because our local meetup evolved into this Bridges of Meaning online Discord server, I had a place to send him because I know there's a writers group there. And I said, I could probably read your book and give you some critique, but there's a group of people that have now sort of come together as, in Christian terms, we call them a body. And if you go there and you pitch this thing, there will be 4 or 5 or 6 people that pick up on that and will engage you deeply and can probably come around you in a sustained way and probably midwife this little vision and project you have, perhaps all the way out into the world. That is so cool. And I want to see more of that, because people look at me because I'm making YouTube and I'm talking out loud, and they say, well, Paul, I want to get at you, but it's like, no, you really don't. You really want an entree into a body of people, a group of people, whereby you can take your particularities, and there are a couple of other physicists on the Bridges of Meaning Discord, and there are some writers, people who like children's books, and moms and dads, and I would be a bottleneck for you. But if I can create a group of people that is far more multifaceted and wiser than I am, where you can come and I can maybe help get you started in there, really cool things can happen. And so that sort of combines the pastoral ministry of listening and translating and decoding with the shepherding ministry, which is gather a group of people together, and that group can be more powerful, more productive, wiser, smarter, more enduring than I as an individual ever can be. And so that's sort of what I've been doing. And I think it can continue to grow. And so, I don't see that. I mean, I see, and when, you came along and started telling me about your vision, and when I started noticing some of your gifts and abilities, I thought, well, this guy is in a lot of ways doing something really similar to what I'm doing. There's some different ways and some different aspects, but so it's not only is it cool to start things like the Bridges of Meaning Discord server, but it's really cool to network with other people who are doing similar things, because in some ways then the network of those groups also becomes like the individual nodes of that network, and the whole thing just gets bigger and stronger. And so that's what I want to see happen.
Now, that's great, by the way, because we do have a lot in common. I haven't attended church in a very long time, except for the occasional Christmas Eve mass or wedding or funeral. But as you know, I take this stuff seriously for sure. Now, there's a reason why a lot of us are surprised by a pastor taking the approach that you're taking. I'm not going to say you're the only one who would take an approach like this, but it's pretty unique. So are you expanding what it is to be a pastor, or is this a side gig? In other words, do you see this as all part of being a pastor, or do you see this as like this other thing you do?
That's a really complex question, because
maybe unfair to present it as a binary, like,
yeah, well, no, but not totally unfair, because there are people, maybe even people in my own local church, who are in some ways my bosses, who might see what I'm doing as a distraction from what I should focus on, which would be the care and attention to the 40, 50 people that is Living Stones Christian Reformed Church in Sacramento. There are others who, and that's a fair thing to ask of me, because I'm employed by that group of people. But there's another aspect that says Living Stones Christian Reformed Church is just a node in the network, and Living Stones Christian Reformed Church isn't really there just for its own members. That church is actually there for the sake of the world. And the church does have to care for its own, but the mission of the church itself is to care for the world. And so others would see what I'm doing as, well, you're just sort of expanding the missionary presence of Living Stones on a far bigger platform. And there's tension between those two perspectives, and rightfully so. But I tend to be the more outward looking kind that says the value of Living Stones is what it is able to bring to a much broader world, more than just the group within. And so I did an interview down in Tucson where I told them, I said, I think what I'm doing is pastoring. I'm just emphasizing the missionary aspect of pastoring more than the holy huddle aspect, because I think actually the holy huddle aspect has been a real problem for churches in North America.
Well, I think the distinction that I would make is it isn't that there aren't a lot of pastors who do various types of small group work and, maybe some ecumenical efforts, but the sort of evangelizing is overt, right? It's pretty clear pretty quickly that these are all essentially tactics toward a larger strategy, which is to get people into the church. And what I really notice about you, and it's something that I really appreciate and respect, is that if that is your goal, it's well camouflaged. You seem to be, if that is the outcome, of course, you'd welcome it, and of course, be open to that. But it does seem that you genuinely enjoy this, and maybe this is a time to drop the term because I'm going to give you a chance to elaborate. An estuary, this space that is a bit it's uncharted territory. You seem to genuinely enjoy that, and if there is any proselytizing going on, I haven't seen it, and that really does make what you're doing quite unique.
There are many who have done similar things. I think to the degree that people will actually participate in anything that I'm related to institutionally, that's in some ways icing on the cake. When Jordan Peterson in his first wave, had a lot of visibility, my biblical metaphor for Jordan Peterson was the unauthorized exorcist, because there's the strange story in the Gospel of Mark where you've got Jesus and his disciples and they're doing their thing. And there's probably, 100, there's 12, but there's about 120 sort of around Jesus. And then there's this other dude running around and he's casting out demons in Jesus' name. And the disciples say, hey, if we got Jesus over here and you shouldn't be doing that if you're not part of us. And so they probably go over and they have some words with him and they come back to Jesus and they want to get permission probably to go, rough him up with a physical cease and desist order. And Jesus says, leave him alone. Because if he's doing this in my name, he's, in a sense, he's with us. What does that mean? And what does that mean for the church? And so I think we should take Jesus seriously with things like this. So to the degree, and just in terms of, I watched my father minister to how many people in Paterson, New Jersey, who never came to Little Northside Chapel. And some people would have thought my father was an idiot for expending his time and resources to people far beyond the little community of Northside Chapel. But I think what my father built in that community was not only the value of Northside Chapel, but of the value of Northside Chapel was in many ways the value that the community experienced beyond its walls. And so I think that's the mission of the church. And so if, as long as a church will allow me to do this kind of thing, I'll keep doing it. If a church would say to me, Paul, you really just have to focus on our people and don't talk to anyone else, I'd probably tell them they've got the wrong person. I'm not going to do it.
I believe that. If I were a proper host, I would have introduced you properly, but you've mentioned your father, which means we also need to mention your grandfather. You're a third generation Christian Reform pastor, graduate of Calvin College, and the pastor of Livingstone's church in Sacramento, California. If I was doing my job properly, I would have gotten all that out of the way initially. Talk a little bit about Estuary.
Well, people, you're not the only one that kind of watches what I do and say, well, what are you doing? And I don't always know what I'm doing. I just sort of do it. And if it seems to be helping the world, I keep doing it. And, people wanted to push me on a little bit more definition. And I had actually had that term for a while because as you well know, here in this wonderful, amazing state of California, if you drive up and down the coast, there are all these, there's big and little estuaries in California. If you're driving down the coast, especially south of Monterey and that beautiful coastline, there's all these rocks in the water, and then there'll be this beach, and then there'll be just this little inlet of a river. And of course, I'm here in the south area of Sacramento, and just right to the south of us is the beginning of the Delta, which is this massive estuary. And a number of years ago, because Dutch people like to play with land and water, in the 1950s, my congregation started because the California Bureau of Reclamation wanted to build all sorts of dams and water projects in the States because the state was expanding. People like to drink. So all these Dutch engineers came, and that meant a Christian Reformed church would have to start. And because I knew all these water engineers, some of them said, you should go to Sausalito and look at the Bay Area model. And I thought, what is that? And so I went there to Sausalito, and it's this warehouse, and it's this enormous scale model, working model of the entire San Francisco Bay estuary. And they keep it running. So the tides are modeled, and, now it's just a curiosity. And I thought, well, why did they build this thing? And then I discovered they built this thing because someone very reasonably said at one point, the Sacramento and the San Joaquin and all this watershed just flows into the sea and's wasted. What if we built a huge dam instead of all these little dams on the rivers, built this huge dam and kept all the fresh water for ourselves? And so they built this model to build this huge dam because they didn't have computer modeling. And they very quickly saw that this would have been a horrible idea, that you would have destroyed all these wetlands and the ecosystem of the California Delta. And so they didn't build a big dam, but they kept the model. And to me, that was just a beautiful picture of what the church should be, because the church should be a life-giving spring of living water, and I'm riffing on Jesus in the Gospel of John, that flows out and blesses the world. That's who Jesus was. That's what the church should be. And so you're right. I'm a really sneaky missionary in that I keep a lot of things cloaked. And so Estuary is part of that, because I say, well, let's have a place where Christians can talk to non-Christians, because it isn't happening at church and it isn't happening very well out in the culture. So let's have some places where we can talk. And if people want to kind of swim upstream into the walled gardens of churches, that's great. If they don't, that's okay too. If churches don't let the water flow out to bless the world, they become stagnant ponds and they silt up. And so this is important for the church, and it's important for the world. And I noticed that this one little word sort of energized people. And I thought, well, that's good. We'll keep playing with this word. But I'm not building a dam, and I'm not building a water project. I want to help lots of little projects and big projects start, because I think I don't want to be a bottleneck in what is a process that is already far beyond me. So that's where Estuary got going.
Well, I've got a ton more questions. We could fill up the entire time just with all my questions. So
I'm waiting for you to come on my channel, Rod. I mean, that invitation's always out there. And
we might have cracked the seal with this conversation.
Are you recording this? Or are you going to post this?
Yeah, Well, we
Oh,
just
good.
might. We are recording it, so we just might.
Okay.
So yeah, let's open this up. I'm sure there's other questions, and I want to give them a chance. So anybody want to chime in here? One of you VanderKlay people, you gotta get us started.
I want to start, but I'm not one of them. But I'm gonna wait for Chris and
All
Yeah,
right,
funny. Nobody wants to jump in.
you guys get stage fright because Eric will go if you won't.
I know Eric's always so good at getting the conversation going. I guess I had a thought before you jumped on the estuary metaphor that it seems strange that a Christian pastor would be having these sorts of conversations, and you can have entire conversations of people, and it never turns into probably what most people would experience as a conversation with a pastor as some sort of like really shallow moralizing or getting deep into theology or something, or warning against these conversations that are happening out in the world. You just are very open, and you talk about so much of the church in America are like these silted ponds, this like remnant of denominationalism that's deep in American Protestantism. And I mean, I kind of grew up in a Southern Baptist denominationalism. I went to Kingwood First Baptist, which was the second Baptist church in the town. And you know, there's different denominations around, and everybody's generally Christian. So there's a general worldview of the religion, but maybe you learn like, oh well, there's always the people that say, well, the Catholics, you know, they used to be Christian, but they're not anymore. I guess the Protestants kept it going. There's been such a breakdown in the particularity of all those denominational cultures, and you really come from one. And I've felt that too. And so much of us grow up really in a secular frame now, even if we have that religious background, because that it really is the cultural water we're swimming in. So this denominational breakdown, the things I'm seeing in the church are like, you know, Protestants becoming like finding the truth in orthodoxy, or loving N.T. Wright, or reading Girard. There's all this cross-pollinating stuff happening within the church as these smaller particularities break down. So there really is this broad emerging mix that's happening, and you kind of just like breached into the gap, and it has to be an expression of just the world you've come out of and how much has changed maybe in the last like 30 years. I guess, you know, somebody like Jordan Peterson comes around. How does he become the catalyst for this type of opening that's happened? And strangely enough, it's the ways that he kind of undercuts the literalism that has really prevailed within the church with trying to read the scriptures and make sense of them with science, because his whole project was like reading all these people trying to like put these two things of science and religion back together. And he has both a critique of modernism, which is maybe like the source of his debate with Sam Harris, but also the critique of postmodernism, even though he's a little bit of both. And so he kind of becomes this weird, like backwards, like kind of character that sounds like Kermit the Frog coming and talking about this really weird Darwinian approach to reading the scriptures and diving into like a psychological significance that dips into this kind of Cartesian reality everybody lives in, what do you think? What do you think how this all plays out within fighting the culture, or not fighting the culture wars, but kind of conceptualizing the space we're in within the culture war and figuring out a way through it? Because that's where I love when you talk about the stories of the Gospels as Jesus existing within a culture war and making everybody mad enough to where they're like, we should just kill the guy.
I think Peterson played a vitally important role because just by virtue of when he emerged and how he positioned himself with respect to the Bible, he sort of marked the end of what has been about 150 years of fighting between modernists and fundamentalists. And he did so by recognizing that, well, he's a scientist, so that puts him sort of on the modernist side, but he doesn't disparage fundamentalists because he looks at fundamentalists with a degree of compassion and says, hey, you've been kicking the slats out of their axiomatic system for 150 years, and you don't expect them to flinch or cry or express pain. What kind of heartless people are you doing this to these people? Hey, they may be wrong about some things, but what you're doing is just simply cruel. And then he comes in with all of this mythos and this symbolism, and then really engages what had already been a deep sort of the next wave in the church, which is ancient modern, and sort of energizes that. And he does that in the midst of this culture war. And so he sort of kind of blew a new pathway, a new direction that everybody sort of saw and said, didn't know what they were seeing, but said, oh. And also at the same time, he illustrated that YouTube is a platform where you can actually make some progress. I mean, Twitter is a mess and Facebook is nearly intolerable, but people will sit and watch or listen to 2 to 3 hours of exploration that is not necessarily easy, but everything before that had said, sound bites are king. And Jordan Peterson said nuts to that. I'm going to talk to you for 2 hours about the Bible and you won't be able to get enough of it. And that to a Christian minister said, well, what's with that? Because, you go beyond, some churches, you go beyond 20, other churches, you go beyond 40 minutes and people are, people are leaving, say, I'm not coming back for more of this. And Jordan Peterson does it for 2 hours and people are lining up for more. Okay, so that then throws a whole bunch of us back and says, well, what on earth are we doing wrong that he's doing right? Maybe we should pay attention. And so I really see Jordan Peterson as sort of breaking through a bunch of things that needed to be broken down. And then in his wake, lots of things happened. Now, of course, Jordan had his wife's illness, his own medical issues. And so we've had this 1.5 year pause from him, which I think has perhaps been a healthy thing overall because it gave space for smaller channels like mine, like John Vervaeke's, like Jonathan Peugeot, like Rebel Wisdom, like a bunch of these guys to say, okay, well, let's, it's kind of when the big tree goes down, the little trees can kind of get a chance to get some time in. So I think, and also the point that we've looked at America as people in church and people not in church. And the church has really perpetuated this idea. But I think especially the work of Tom Holland had noted that, okay, some people are going to church and some people aren't, but America and the West are deeply Christian in ways that everyone else in the world understood. But Americans and those in the West were just looking at themselves saying, I'm not a Christian because I don't go to church. And the people in church are saying, you're not a Christian because you don't go to church. And Tom Holland comes along and Jordan Peterson comes along and says, we're all sort of Christian. And all of these ideas, we're working them through. Why don't we have conversations across these little walls? And actually, it'll probably be good for people both inside the church walls and outside the church walls. And maybe there's stomach for this, because when I look at, the big things that people are fighting about in the culture, you can find proof texts and Bible verses for both camps. And for a long time already, those who have been critical of churchy Christianity have been using Christian arguments against the church. It's not a bad thing for the church. It should purify the church, but it also forces the church to say, hey, this is our book. What are we doing with it? So I think overall, Jordan's ascent both illuminated a bunch of things that needed to happen in the culture, but also should be instructive of the church. And I think in some small ways, I'm not the only one who's paid attention. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think so. It's like there was an initial wave where it felt exciting from within the church, the types of conversations that got sparked because of a guy like Jordan Peterson. Now, the problem was, like, for me, too much of it got sparked by all the culture war political stuff, which was interesting, but kind of annoying because it didn't get at, the things like that were in his classroom lectures or in the biblical series. Most Christians who I would talk to, who I showed it to or got interested, didn't really understand how to frame it. And the problem was this wasn't a problem actually, but what happened was the only people who really knew how to frame it were those of us who had gone through this level of deconstruction. And there was a big pull towards progressivism, essentially. And it got Jordan Peterson popped up at such a strange moment to kind of like to make this division between those who went woke and progressive Christian, which in the years preceding, most of them just kind of renounced faith and just have this very like bland blue church world. And the rest of those who went through deconstruction, but this kind of Petersonian psychological approach was like, at the same time, somebody's going to call it heretical, but these people feel like they've found a way to reconstruct a frame, at least to take the Bible seriously, or take all those models that exist within those parts of your biology and your simulated frame that have been exapted by the stories of the Bible, essentially. I think it's going to be interesting to see whether the church starts really moving in a direction where they're no longer taking these literalist approaches to the Genesis stories, or some parts of theistic philosophy that really can be deconstructed by New Testament or gospel messages, right? There are ways to build a theistic theology that don't necessarily jive with Christian theology at the same time. Maybe like so much of what I see of people's theism is just like that weak deism. God is so far out there, right? Or the other social imaginary that exists is some sort of simulation theory. But I'm going to be interested to see what pops up from Estuary and in the upstream. And I'm excited with Nuance Forum being part of that project, because it's, when you announced it, I was like, oh yeah, NF is Estuary. Like, that's what we've been doing. And when Kevin and I first came, we went into it like expecting it to feel like a Christian small group. And then we were like, yeah, it kind of was, but we didn't like use all the Christianese language. We talked about real stuff. you know, people just giving their heart, talking about how it's hard to date and all this kind of stuff. And you didn't have to sift through all this Christianese language, which I think is such a problem when it comes to Christian conversations in the world or whatever. And you do such a great job of just bowling over those divisions and just going for it. So,
Well, thank you.
yeah.
Well, I'll be interested to hear what Rod has to say, that his Nuance Forum is just sort of like a
Rod's
Christian-
our pastor.
Ouch.
He's our
Really know
small
how to
group
hurt a
leader.
guy. Never mind about that recording.
Yeah,
We'll memory hole this one.
it's okay, Rod. Pastors are well respected.
Yeah, when I get discouraged, someone will remind me, yeah, you sound like you're a pastor of a small church.
Yeah.
Can I
Go
lay
ahead, Kevin.
out? Yeah. Can I lay out a few bowls, and you can dip your hands in which ones you choose? That they're all related, but I'm working through the final chapters of Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, and I know this is probably old news to a lot of you that may have read this back when it was like published in like 2012 or whatever, but found it very illuminating for myself, just navigating the world in this time. And I feel like there's a lot of what Peterson has done to speak to things that Haidt brings up, but most specifically, I think, here's one question and I'll elaborate. Do you think the modern church, or like the modern Western church, has just presented a straw man of itself? And what I mean by that is, Haidt makes a reasonable argument that religion is a poor adaptation for individuals. It's a great adaptation for groups, right? And I feel like the new atheists, like your Sam Harris or Dawkins and Hitchens, they go with the, religion is the mind virus. The virus wants to survive and it'll kill anything in its path just to get further. But that's looking at only from like an individual point of view, and you can find anecdotes as if, holy war, suicide bombers is an obvious one, right? But religion as a group adaptation is actually quite ingenious. And we were actually we drift between these realms of the individual and these realms of the group. We've adapted throughout our human history. So do you think the modern church has strawmanned itself by saying like, you have to be, or you have to profess, or it is aiming at this individual? And so we actually perceive as religion as like an individual adaptation or an individual identity maker, rather than what it was maybe meant to be, is like more of a group adaptation. And I feel like we all find our groups somewhere. It's like, that is so natural to us. And I mean, one thing that I do see in your work is you're finding the groups within the groups that didn't know they were groups, like people that want to talk about this. You can find Christian conversation like circling in those areas too. But that's kind of, I've set the table. Dime, please.
Well, Haidt doesn't get enough attention in these conversations. In many ways, Haidt was there before Peterson. It's just Haidt is measured, academic. He's very compassionate and warm, and then Jordan comes in as a bull in the china shop and is just, breaking things. And so of course Jordan got all the attention, but Jonathan Haidt laid the table. And I had read Jonathan Haidt before I ever found Jordan Peterson. I had read The Righteous Mind, and then I went back and read The Happiness Hypothesis, which if you really enjoyed The Righteous Mind, go back and read The Happiness Hypothesis, because in many ways, The Righteous Mind is Jonathan Haidt's 12 rules, and The Happiness Hypothesis is a much less tortured maps of meaning. That's really where Haidt kind of lays everything out and takes religion on directly, and begins with the assertion that ancient wisdom was wisdom. And there's a lot that contemporary people can benefit from that wisdom. Now, it was very interesting. So I just recently did a commentary video on Jordan Peterson's conversation with Susan Blackmore on Justin Brierley's podcast, Unbelievable. And Susan Blackmore in that podcast says, well, religion is good for individuals. And you can tell that because people who, now when we're using religion here, as in my recent videos, I call it religion S. This is what secular people identify as religious, going to church, praying, those kinds of things. Religious people on study after study after study live longer, are happier, have more stable family structures, on and on and on. The benefits of participation in religious institutions is easily seen in terms of individual participation. And Susan Blackmore said, but religion is a disaster for communities. And I really love what you just said, because you sort of inverted it. And I'm not saying you don't have to really choose between the perspectives, because what Susan Blackmore was looking at in many ways was the continuing, what Charles Taylor calls big R reform, that happened in the Protestant Reformation, where the Protestant churches sort of in collaboration with the piecemeal civil authorities of the Holy Roman Empire broke open the power in Western Europe of the Roman Catholic Church. But then the Enlightenment comes along and sort of breaks open the power of every church, and really calls out a lot of corruption and deception and shallow thinking and so on and so forth. Now, in the video that's going to be released tomorrow, one way to conceptualize of human beings and human community is this massive real-time exploration computation system. And the way we find the boundaries of what is workable is by human fodder. People pick up ideas that are bad ideas and they take it to the extreme, and everybody can see that this is a bad way to live. It's like alcohol. Drink a little bit of alcohol, that's fine. Drink a little more, it's probably okay. Drink a lot of it and drink it all the time and stay drunk, it's a disaster. And so human beings sort of find the borders in that way. And so what we see in history is that we keep finding the limits of these things and the limits of these ideas. And so part of what we're doing now is, well, sort of in Roman Catholic Europe, we saw the limits of pushing that model to its extreme. And then it basically gets torn up and collapsed by the Protestant Reformation, and then the Enlightenment. And really what we saw at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, were the limits of the Enlightenment. And the Western world then had the enormous distraction of 2 world wars and a Cold War. And now, once again, in some ways, we're all the way back to the Middle Ages. And at least for a little while, we're kind of engaging with the Islamic world. But the Islamic world is not what it was during the Middle Ages. It's piecemealed and it's not really a major threat. Now we're looking at, okay, what is China going to bring online? And so we're continuing to work through these very large issues. But each of us as individuals have to, of course, navigate in our own little ways. And part of what has been helpful about Jordan Peterson was, again, sort of as we're getting beyond the corruption of the blue church, Jordan Peterson, again, brings in the fact that, yeah, we can, if we define religion as sort of church going and praying and all of these things that secular people look to religion as, if you define it that way, it's not going to be terribly helpful. If you define it as actually your worldview, and as if you recognize that both people in the church and outside the church are behaving in deeply religious ways, well, maybe you can begin to understand and chart what you need to do. And then, for example, recent podcast with Brett Weinstein, he says, well, and he's very allergic to the supernatural, but he says, well, but maybe the reason that the Jews have been able to endure all these years is because they had rituals. It's like, yeah, that's a real part of the reason. But you're not going to disconnect and this is what's in Jonathan Haidt's happiness hypothesis, you're not going to disconnect those rituals from the ideas. And so each of us as individuals have this tiny little time clock that's going somewhere between, you know, if we're fortunate and healthy, between 70 and 100 years of living. We have relationships. We have all these things to do. Okay, how are we going to navigate through this cornfield? And so, you know, some of these thinkers, I think, are really helpful in helping us. And in fact, churches should be helpful, but churches are, of course, the expression, at least in the American landscape, they're the expression of communities with set answers. And so this is why this is not a far reach for me as a pastor. Most pastors are institutionally determined to continue to provide the set answers. The problem is we're in an environment of hyper change, and answers from the 1950s and 60s, which religion-wise is not very long ago, are already breaking down, and we need newer answers. And so what's actually happening in churches is a great deal of experimentation. And of course, unfortunately, as a human being, we don't, as individuals, get a lot of chances at experimenting, you know? So you find someone, you fall in love, you get married. Well, that experiment is going to go from 2 to 7 to 30 years. And if you only live for 80 years, you only have so many of those in you. So you want to leverage these long-standing wisdom institutions to say, what have these people learned? What should I practice? But at the same time, we as human beings aren't terribly reflective. And so we just kind of stumble into things mindlessly. And as we get into our 30s, 40s, and 50s, we begin to say, oh my, I should have thought about this. Well, thinking would have helped you somewhat. What you really need to do is pay much greater attention and see everything, but that takes time too. In the meantime, you've got to go to work, and now you're already entangled in relationships, familiar or romantic, and you have children, and you just got all this sorting stuff out to do, and you're in a race to the grave. So there's the human condition. I don't know if that helps.
I mean, this is fantastic. It actually, I watched today, I watched your video on your thoughts on the Kanye interview with Rogan. I actually haven't watched that interview, but watched your video, and you kind of, what I found really helpful in that too was the I guess it was Chesterton. I never knew this, but the fence analogy, is that it? You come across a fence in a field, and you better think long and hard before you tear it down. Why is this fence here? You know? And I feel like maybe there was something about Peterson coming along that's like, my dad's a pastor. I grew up in the church. And it was that he just had, he had to be the guy with the answers. They get the people that come into the office, and there wasn't necessarily an exploration of the land around the fence. It was just like, hey, I found this fence. Tell me what you think about it. And that was what my dad did. And I feel like Peterson kind of let us walk the edge of it and explain, like, look at the landscape around it and maybe look at the architecture within it or something. There was more exploration, which for me, as a believer, made me feel like I was a part of something again, right? Like not just a hub of answers or doctrine or something. It brought it back to life, and he's, I don't even call him a pastor. He's not a pastor. He's a thinker, I guess. But, it's very, very interesting. And I think you're totally right. I'm sure that many churches were looking at Peterson and just saying, like, what is this guy doing right that he can hold the attention of people for 3+ hours and I can barely get through 25 minutes or whatever, it's interesting. But yeah, there's, I think that collective exploration has been, highly, I guess, healing for myself, or, and Chris and I mean, a lot of people that we come across, like a lot of similar Peterson stories from all corners of upbringing or whatever. So anyway, I'll step out.
Thanks for sharing that.
Eric F., are you
Yeah, I wanted to share something a bit more personal. And like, when I first found Peterson, it was like a couple years ago. I went to a Sydney lecture, and anyway, and deep diving into that world. But I feel like I've landed into spaces, and I wanted to. There's a part of me that's always seeking guidance, and I think maybe that's the Catholic in me, or the Filipino in me, or the person in me. But I like to try to land as far as I can to an answer, and when I reach it, the moment I think I know what I'm talking about, then I feel uneasy. It's like, I don't know if that's, I don't ever want to feel like, oh yeah, I get it. I get everything. But I want to land there as much as I can. But anyway, going through the Peterson thing, I think I landed in two places. One, I saw the importance fundamentally of the biblical stories. Fundamentally, I think I, connect with it. It's like, but then the question of, well, especially in Nashville or Tennessee, it's like, well, are you Christian or are you religious? I was like, what does that even mean? Like, I don't know what that, like, what do you mean by that? Like, cause there's churches here and people attending every Sunday, etc. But where I wanted to get personal, I wanted to seek your, again, like, this is where I've landed, and I want someone who's way smarter than me and has studied it way more than I have, to be able to go, well, maybe there's something more. But where I've landed is from seeking and searching, at least in this idea of being Christ-like. And I ask myself that all the time. What does that mean? And without riffing on too long, I've landed in this, where, to me, I learned a lot from facing your burdens or picking up your cross. And to me, that was about, well, I tried to define it and make sure that when I say it, I mean it. And when I mean it, I'm doing it. And when I was trying to define it, cross and burden to me, because that's such a thing that many people throw around, like, oh, we all have our own burdens to carry and crosses to bear, etc. And I'm like, well, what is that? What's a cross? What's a burden? And then the normal answer would be, from a lot of people that I would try to have those conversations with, they would be like, well, there's pornography, there's drugs, there's I need to be nicer at work, I need to be a better friend or whatever. And personally, and again, this is always a personal thing, to me, that wasn't a burden or a hurdle, because I'm trying to define what a cross means. And I'm like, well, what's a cross? Well, to me, it was something so heavy that you'll fall, something that you'll eventually die from it, if that's how I'm following that story. So where I've landed it, well, what's the heaviest cross? Well, I mean, what's the thing that I'm trying to always pick up things that I should, in terms of personal responsibility. And I'm trying to find the heaviest things that I can. If I can't carry it, it means, well, that means I need to build myself up to be able to pick that up. And the last thing, at least right at this moment, or within this search, that I feel that I've landed is, well, the heaviest cross that I can carry, that I can't handle, that I can't figure out, that I fall every time I really think about it, is, what if nothing means anything? And what if God doesn't exist? And that's where I land every time. And because I can't think of anything harder. And a lot of people would respond to me like, oh, well, maybe you're overthinking. Maybe you're putting too much pressure on yourself. And I go, yeah, maybe. But all I'm trying to do is search. If we all are. And that's where I've landed. And normally when I have conversations and I share that story, I mean, I try to compact that as quick as I can and try to riff on that uh, in conversation, most of the time, because I'm very loud and I'm very strong in what I say and what I do. Normally, I don't go anywhere with the conversation. It's just like person's like, okay. And well, I guess why I wanted to share that and see what if that question's been laid out. Like again, this is from like learning a lot from Jordan Peterson and really tackling that and seeing where I reach it and seeing how far I can go. And I don't like the feeling of, well, that's the answer, because it doesn't feel like it's like, yes, I land there every time and I feel free, and I feel like accepting that allows me to be free, and accepting that allows me to live joyously and give as much as I can, because I'm not bounded uh, by burdens. So because I've cast my burdens. But the fact that I think that that's right bothers, like, not bothers, not the word, but you know what I mean? Like I said, there's that part of me that's always seeking, well, maybe there's more. I don't know. Anyway, that's where my man.
Well, that's sort of the existentialist path. I don't know if you've read many existentialists, but the existentialists got to the point of, Kierkegaard got there way earlier, but at least by the middle of the 20th century, especially after the two world wars and the world on the brink of nuclear annihilation in the Cold War, many authors and writers, very late stage Protestantism, began to say, like, well, what if there is nothing? What if there is nothing? And then they began to feel that burden and that weight. And so it isn't, I very much understand what you're describing there. And some existentialists looked at that as radical freedom. But very quickly, the radical freedom began to be a weight, because radical freedom, limitless freedom is ironically almost identical to unlimited responsibility. That's what I heard you say. That's crushing. Kierkegaard has this this despair unto death article where, basically part of the article is someone dies, someone's life is painful, so they decide life is absurd, life is painful, I'm simply going to end it, because they're living in despair. And so then they end their physical, biological life, only to learn in their horror that they were wrong about that aspect, and the despair followed them through the grave. Then what do? Because, and so what the existentialists then had to deal with is, okay, if the world is absurd, if there is no God, if I am actually radically free, what does that mean? Then again, that you just trigger that irony that radical freedom very quickly looks almost identical to absolute responsibility, because you alone, there's no governing ought that you can pursue and fulfill. Now you even have to make that part up yourself. And so you can take that two ways. One way would be, well, look around at the track record of human beings and figure out what's the best way to live. Or decide there is no best way to live, I'll feed my appetites. But those get shallow quickly. So, I mean, there are others who have come to the same place as you and worked on those questions. And also part of what comes with existentialism and this framework is others can't help you. You're on your own. So there's the, there you are. that's how that frame goes. That's how that line goes. And yeah, read The Existentialists. That you won't be alone. and there are plenty of people who have worked through these ideas and thinking about them. And yeah, you might find some things that you find helpful.
Eric, I wanted to chime in for a second because, we love bringing things down to a personal level as much as possible to speak from personal experience. It's easy to become abstract when we talk about these kinds of things. So I always appreciate that you do that. And whenever we do that. And it occurred to me, as you were kind of searching for the words and we were all kind of following you wherever you were taking us. And then all of a sudden you said it, right? And then it was as if, that one question was like, it's the very bottom and all the way to the right of the periodic table, right? It's the most dense, heaviest thing that you could have said, right? Which is at the heart of every one of these questions. And the fact that you propose that as a cross, as a burden, the heaviest burden you could think of, rather than this kind of glib, dismissive way that so many atheists often talk about this subject. In a sense, both approaches are trying to address this question, right? But one way to do it is to be glib, to be dismissive, to poke holes, to show all the absurdities, and in a sense to do it from a place where you don't have enough skin in the game, because you have the same, when I say you, I mean whoever is doing this, right? You've got the same problem that I have, that we all have, right? When it's 3 a.m., you still have to confront the same demons that everyone else has to confront. But the fact that you framed this not as, just that kind of easy way to poke holes at belief systems that you'll see a lot of, at least not thoughtful atheists do, that you took the opposite approach and said, this is the heaviest thing that I can find. I really appreciate that. I'd never heard it framed that way, that question is the heaviest cross anyone could carry.
It came from firstly, growing up Catholic, but at the same time, it came from that Peterson world, because like what Paul was saying, that, fundamentally he has it. He's meeting this modernist thing, but with this appreciation with fundamental ideals. And like I saw, the only way at least personally, the only way I think something makes sense if I do it, if I test it, if I test the waters and see what happens if I take personal responsibility. What happens if I make sure that I'm reaching for the highest good or the brightest star? And what happens if I try to figure it out, even if it turns left, right, and I'm not going up, I'm still moving. And personally, what started happening was when I tested myself, or when I used those lessons, especially from his book, life just got, better is not the word, meaningful. Yeah. And personally, I couldn't say, that's wrong, because when I did it, it made more sense. And then, so when I use that term, I can't say that the Bible's whatever. I can't. And I can't even, and that's why it's weird. It's this weird it's always my favorite stories, or at least biblical verses, are when it's a paradox, when it's always against itself. Because it's like, yeah, well, it makes sense, because if life was easy, we would all figured it out. But so that's when I landed in that paradox of like, well, what's the most, what's the highest good I can reach? How? Well, how can I do that? Well, that means I need to be able to make sure that at least with the things that I can reach, I can lift it and make it better. Well, then I use that term a lot, the cross thing, because one, there's a history in it, but also because at least in Nashville, you have that conversation, it hits people. It makes them like, oh, I understand. Like, or I'm Christian, so I get it. It's hard to just go straight existentialist and be like, well, what if nothing means anything? Straight away. And like, no, I don't know. But the responsibility is what I keep hooking on to, I guess. It's like, well, carrying your burden or picking up the hardest thing, the heaviest thing that you can. And I guess that's where I find meaning. And I can't let go of it just yet, I think. I don't think I've reached pure existentialist, because then I still feel that there's something that I'm responsible for. Yeah, I guess. I don't know. Anyway.
Audio now unmuted alert.
I guess I don't really understand what the problem is if nothing means anything. And I don't mean to say that in one of the glib atheist ways, even though I'm one of the atheists in the group.
Sorry, Rory.
Having come from a very evangelical Christian upbringing for most of my life, I understand, what it means to be, to look forward to the hereafter, the afterlife, and heaven, and seeing Grandpa again, and blah blah blah, and blah blah blah. But since I don't believe that anymore, I don't think the quality of my life has suffered. Maybe Eric or somebody could expound on what if you were to come to the realization that there is nothing after, and there is ultimately, in the grand 14 billion years of the universe, cosmic meaning of anything, how does that change how you're going to live now? Because you still live now, and so you still have meaning because you are here, and you still know people, and those people have meaning to you. So why is it important that there is some cosmic, everlasting, eternal meaning, and not just that the meaning is that I'm here now, and I have people around me that I care about that are here now. So therefore, I want to be a good person because of that.
Personally, I think that's where the paradox is in my head, because the way I phrase it can sound like it's a problem, but it wasn't that there was a problem. It's that I'm giving meaning. I mean, by reaching for the highest good in my head, personally, I am giving meaning and importance to those relationships. I think the way I phrase it with like picking up, it does sound like it's a chore or an exercise, but I think that's where the paradox meets, Rory. And I agree with you, because I'm trying to like, well, where do I disagree? Well, I don't disagree. I agree. Yes, sorry.
Can I take a crack at this? And then I want to serve it over to Paul, because in a sense, the way I see this is that the degree to which the modern church is losing relevance, losing cultural currency, it's that as we become more and more aware of our natural environment, and we as science and all the things that we have learned about the natural world and whatever we think we know about it, as that has progressed, the answers, as you know, we're referring to the answers here tonight, have become increasingly inadequate. And in a sense, you could say that it's the logical end to, you know, the questions. Once you learn that the Earth isn't 6,000 years old or whatever, that, you know, once you learn that eventually the whole universe is going to, you know, the sun is eventually going to explode, you start having questions like this, and the systems that were in place to help us make sense of life they're not holding up very well, right? So you could almost argue that atheism is kind of the logical end to these kinds of questions. And so I guess what I would say, I mean, and I'm sure this is not a new question for you, Paul, but in a sense, that is the existential question for the church as well, is that a lot of the answers that the church has been proffering aren't working, right? They're not giving people the solace that they seek and the meaning that they seek.
I don't know if I agree that that's actually the source of sort of the great shrug and walk away that we've seen happening over the last 60 years. I think meaning, you know, one of the things that Jordan Peterson, I think, really put his finger on, and he did so because if you read the end of his book, 12 Rules for Life, he goes into quite a bit of detail about what it meant to be a father of a daughter who had a medical condition that could only be treated with, at least within the realm of what the doctors were looking at, repeated painful surgeries. And so they were regularly in the hospital with their daughter who was facing, you know, ankle surgery or leg surgery because she had this childhood arthritis that kept basically seizing up her joints, and they'd have to break them. And you know, it's one thing to come into this world as a child to have this because you've known no other world, but the parents know children should not live like this, because both he and his wife grew up running and enjoying life without spending long periods of time in the hospital enduring painful surgeries and the recovery afterwards. And so when you listen to Jordan Peterson with his philosophy of life, the question is, how can you bear up under tremendous suffering? And his answer was meaning. Now, Jordan left the church when he was a smart 12-year-old and didn't really go back. And so you're right in that what the church had to offer him, at least up until this point in his life, wasn't doing anything for him that he didn't figure he could do better getting on his own. But I don't know if that is really an address about the church's quality of the answers as much as the competition for short-term solutions and distractions, which over the last 80 years we've really gotten good at. You know, there was a small community in the Dominican Republic called La Isleta, which basically means the little island. And it wasn't on an island, it was on the top of a hill for which there was no drivable road. So every time I had to visit that church, I either had to hike up this hill. Once they brought down a mule because they thought that would be the thing to do for the missionary and everything. But what they didn't understand is I had no idea how to ride a mule up a narrow mountain road. And quite frankly, it was better to walk. But there were two institutions in that town. There was a church and a bar. And in the bar, you got alcohol and dancing and smoking. And, you know, that would usually lead to some degree of fornicating, as the church would call it. And in the church was sitting there and listening to the minister and singing and listening to the Bible. And those were the two things that they were able to do in that community. There was no electricity. There were these two things. And every night you had the bar and you had the church. And in some ways, I think what has happened in our culture is that everything else has grown, and we can distract ourselves and adjust ourselves and educate ourselves, and we can sort of feed off of the centuries of answers that the church amongst other religious communities have employed to address the suffering in the world. And so Peterson comes along and says, you know what? The real antidote for suffering and chaos is meaning and action. And Peterson, harvested from biblical stories and learned from existentialists and did all of that work and provided for him really the fruit of the church and philosophy and psychology and cognitive science and all of those things in order to construct for himself a bulwark against suffering, which was meaning. And so I think in some ways, the great walking away has sort of been the success of the church, that at the end of, the church was sort of no longer needed for what it used to provide. Now, I think that is true to a degree, except that what we see happening now are individuals like John Vervaeke and Brett Weinstein and many, many others who are now saying, well, the church was sort of a one-stop shop that provided, to a degree, some philosophical answers, some rituals, some practice, some community, some staffing. You didn't have a psychologist, at least in the old time, but the pastor sort of functioned that way. And, it was sort of like aspirin. That was the best you had. You had aspirin. But now we've got all these other things. But now we're beginning to realize that a lot of the things that the church used to provide, the churches aren't there anymore, or they're too insular. And so people are now looking, hey, we need places to meet because, okay, I don't have all the needs we used to need and have, and that the church survived, that the church sufficed. But a lot of the things that the church did, we really don't have anymore because there's always sort of this delay. And right now with COVID, a lot of church people are like, boy, I can sleep in on Sunday and still feel myself a Christian and just watch the pastor on Zoom or on the church website and get the sermon. And I can do that for a long time, but we're living a long time, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And you get sick now as you get into your 60s and nobody's bringing you a casserole. And maybe your kids will come visit you, but you don't want to tell your kids that, 30 years ago you had an affair and you cheated on your wife and you feel really guilty about it. And well, maybe you could pay a therapist to sit down and listen to you talk, but even just in the transaction, that's not the same. And so part of the reason the church is full of old people is because on one hand, these are people who have grown up in the church, but on the other hand, these are people that have gotten to the place in their life where they say, I really need a community and I really need a pastor. And I know all of the answers are sort of out there and I can find them on YouTube and in the library and on the internet, but it's just different if someone comes into my room and plays God for me. Where else are you going to find that? And so I think as a culture, we're working this stuff through. And I think what we're going to find is that, yeah, you go to a church and the music isn't as good as it is professionally done. And the preacher isn't as good as the top 5 celebrity preachers out there. And he's not as well informed as these psychologists and historians, all of whom are now, their books are available on Amazon and their wisdom is available on YouTube. But I really sort of need a place that I can be in the midst of people who not only, maybe they don't know all of this, but they just know enough of it that together we can embody something that all the other diverse mechanisms can't really give me. So I think we're in that process, and in the process, the church is learning. And I think part of the reason that in the American sphere, churches are, hey, provide service or die. There's no tax money propping you up. And so I think we're in that process. And so I'm not surprised that we're playing around with Zoom meetings and estuaries and meetup groups and all of those things. And that, well, son of a gun, churches are kind of a good place to do this. And it's kind of nice to have someone around who is not really a psychologist, but he knows how to listen. He's not really a philosopher, but he knows who Plato is. And he's not the best preacher in the world, but he knows Jesus' parables, and he's here. And I know him, and he knows me. And so I don't think the church is going anywhere. It's just continuing to have to up its game. So that's sort of my answer to that.
Audio now unmuted alert.
So what would you say, this is Rory again, what would you say is, like, what would be the benefit for me to attend your church or a church, as a person who doesn't believe that the world was created in 6 days, as a person who doesn't believe there was a boat that had 2 of every animal on it, if I also don't believe that Jesus fed 5,000 with 2 fish and 5 loaves, or maybe I have it backwards, and I don't believe that he, died and raised up from the dead, and all, like, if I don't believe in any of those stories, then are you arguing that the benefit that I, as a skeptic, would get from still attending church is just that I would have a community, that I would have someone who would bring me a casserole when I'm sick? Or, like, what would you say would be the advantage for a person who doesn't believe in supernatural things to be involved in a church?
Well, there are plenty of churches that don't believe in supernatural things. It's just really telling that those churches also don't seem to thrive and endure over time. So, but let's set all that aside and maybe use the illustration of a family. Basically in our culture, and Yuval Harari and Sapiens makes this point quite clearly, in our culture we've sort of offloaded all the traditional things that family offered to the states. And so let's say at 15 or 16 or 17 you can emancipate yourself, and maybe you've got some job skills and you can go out and you can make money and you can do all of these things. And then and you don't bother paying any attention to your family. And then you get a message, Dad has cancer. Okay, Dad has cancer. Dad died. Okay, Dad died. Mom has cancer. Okay, Mom has cancer. Mom died. Okay, Mom died. Sister's getting older. Okay. And you kind of live through your life, and you go through your life, and you use all the things that the state and institutions and all the things that the market and the state can provide for you. And then maybe your sister lived this way too, and she died, and you think, well, she died. What's going to happen? What's going to mark my sister's life? And so then you say, okay, well, maybe I should go and sit with my sister's corpse at least for a minute before she goes into the furnace. And maybe someone should say something and say, sister maybe wasn't the prettiest woman in the world. She didn't have the most money. She maybe kind of worked a sucky job that paid the bills and didn't really have any meaningful relationships, but she mattered. She was my sister. And then you begin to wonder, well, what happens when I expire? Will anyone come? Does my life matter? And so it's not just community. It's community tied with the assertion that all of the things we go through in our life have meaning beyond just their biological necessity for the moment. And churches provide that. Funerals, I've never really seen, it always sort of amazes me when atheists kind of sheepishly approach me because they want to rent the place, and maybe I'd say something because one of their friends has died. Well, okay, they expired. None of us want to leave this world with a bunch of people that are just saying, going to shrug. They might say, well, they were my friend. Well, that's good. They were your friend. What's more? And so I think there are deep reasons why these things continue. And the truth is, atheism seems to be always a minority position, and the vast majority of people, and atheists can easily, say, well, this is just inherited patterns of past ages. Yeah, but they seem to endure. And when I go to atheist funerals, I see people kind of embracing each other, singing the songs of when they were 16 or 17 years old. And I think, I bet you their life was worth a better song. And the church throughout time, even though their music can be kind of crappy, at least has some understanding of piecing some words together that lend significance to these lives that we lead. So I don't expect that to convince you, but that's what I've seen.
I want to give others a chance. Anyone else also want to chime in here?
I'll jump in with a question, and it's not fully formed by any means. I'm someone who did not grow up with religion at all. I mean, you had to drag me to an Easter service with the lure of a toy or something like that, or a Christmas mass to sit through it. So, it's never been a part of my life, my parents or anything. And, I've had my own thoughts with religion, having seen, frankly, friends that have been torn away from me as a result of them going down a path where all of a sudden, like, a friendship with me or a group of friends, was no longer fit the model of where their path was going religiously. And that created definitely some tension with me of how I felt like there was these other motivations pulling a friend away. All that to be said, I've come to terms with that over the years of whatever works for someone to have a moral compass in their lives with their path, good on them. And I totally, see the benefits of, that sense of community. I mean, I haven't started reading it yet, but I just listened to this podcast, Armchair Expert, and he had a few back. He had Vivek Murthy, who's the Surgeon General, and he wrote a book called Together, and sort of the power, or actually I should say the epidemic of loneliness on the human body, and that sort of being like as detrimental as like smoking, is being lonely and needing that human connection. So for those that is their sense of community and connection, wonderful, it's providing a human need, a basic human need. I'm curious from your perspective too, maybe this outs me as an only child asking this, but what are your thoughts on church and religion and all those things needing to be a constant pulling someone back, be it every Sunday or something? Do you see religion having that need to sort of almost help someone grow up to where they can be comfortable with their sense of self so they can go out into the world and then just, kind of ping with whatever aspects of religion they need when they need it, but not always needing to be tethered to an every Sunday or regular, religious in the sense of having a religion, but, kind of helping them grow up like a parent would help a kid go, okay, now go into the world, I'm here when you need me, kind of thing.
I think I don't think it's hard to understand, especially let's say looking at parenting styles where, some families gather around the dinner table together every night. And if they do that together every night, there'll be nights that they don't do it. Or if eating is sort of, there's a pile of food in the kitchen, you go make your plate, and then you go back in front of the TV or to your room in front of the computer game, and so on and so forth. There's something to the ritual and the routine and the repetition that forms and shapes human beings in a very deep way. Now, that can be for good or that can be for evil, but there are things that we do all the time very rhythmically, like sleep. And so the question then comes, where is it in terms of one's priorities? Most of us have had the experience of having a friend fall in love, and that that relationship rips them from the friend group, and maybe just for a while or maybe permanently. Most of us don't look at that and say, romantic love should be banned because it separates people. And gosh, they spend all their time together. Can't you spend one night out with your old friends? So I see this as part of sort of the normal development of human beings, in that if, for example, well, you're wearing, how many times when I visit Nashville via Zoom, I see Gibson on a hat or Fender on a shirt. And if you want to be I grew up learning two musical instruments, the piano and the violin. And I remember at one point, I think it was in junior high, my violin teacher had a come to Jesus talk with me and basically said, hey, look, there are two levels of musicians in our class. There are these kids up here who play the violin well, and these kids down here who don't. And you see that, and you're just in the middle. You know what the difference is? All of us know what the difference is. You need to practice. You need to be on that violin every day. And I think that's just part of human beings. Now, others might say, other friends might say, Paul won't come out to play because he's in there practicing his violin. Well, that doesn't sound very good in our culture, unless, of course, Paul becomes a virtuoso and then everybody watches him play that instrument and says, wow, I wish I could do that. And that's a function of repetition. So a lot of it depends on what you want to build, who you want to be, and where the values are. A lot of people have, as a pastor, there are people that I know that every Sunday we open the door, they are in here, and they bear the benefits of that because the relationships are tight. Other people are in a few times a year, and then they look at some of these people that every week and like, they really know their Bible. They really have deep friendships and relationships here. And it's like, well, they put in the time. And others who don't put in the time then come to a place and say, Pastor, I'm really looking for that confidence and trust that I am in God's hands. And even though I'm facing this medical challenge, that everything's going to be all right. And usually the difference between those who can face those challenges well and those who can't is sort of who put in the time. And I think that's just sort of a rule in lots of areas of life. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but.
Yeah, I mean, to the degree, like to your point of what you want to build, I guess the cliche of teach a man to fish kind of thing. And again, like I said, I think it's out to me as an only child in a lot of ways. I'm like, I like to figure something out, and I like to go do it, like to try it. And then if I need help, I go ask for help. But, it's sort of the reason college and school didn't work out for me. I'm like, I can't sit and learn a bunch of stuff without just like doing it along the way. And so, I'm always curious about that. If you're constantly tethered somewhere to the source, well, then, at what point does the source say, like, no, you got enough of me, like, go out, figure it out. We're always here when you want to come back, and having that be, a sense of encouragement of go experience, try things out, fail, and then come back to the source when you need it, be that next Sunday or next year or never again kind of thing, because those skills have been equipped for someone to say, I can kind of go survive now.
Yep. And I think you're right. And say another example of this would be attachment to a parent. Children that are well attached to parents wind up being the ones who can actually go out and be most free because their bond is secure. Children who are not well attached to their parents are often coming back looking for reinforcement. And so, I mean, there's lots of things in life like this. So I think that's an excellent point.
Well, I have to take a host prerogative here. You've heard me talk a lot about notes for notes. Well, you were just talking to my partner in that. That's our fearless leader and CEO of Notes for Notes. That's Phil Gilly there. Welcome, Phil, by the way. It's great to have you on this call.
No,
Anybody?
I appreciate it. Can I just ask one more question on that? Because there's something, Rod, you and I have talked a lot about over the years, but is codependence, sort of recognizing when you have codependence, in a romantic relationship where you just become so enmeshed, is there a point where there's too much codependence in someone's faith, or in God, where they're actually detached from being able to have real human connections because their identity is so wrapped up in that? And sort of then how do you unpack that for the well-being while also not trying to crush what might be the thing kind of holding them together? How do you detox them if you see situations like that?
There are people who run to the church in order to escape the world. And again, my idea of what the church is for, the church is not here to be a refuge from the world. The church is here to be a servant to the world. And so, yeah, pastorally, you see that too. You see people who have a codependent relationship with church, but just as in either romantic or parent-child codependent relationships, generally speaking, those people have a very unhappy relationship with the church as well, because they are imagining that the church is going to satisfy them in ways that the church isn't built to satisfy them. Your mom can't be your wife, and your wife can't be your mom. And the church should be the church. And
Break that one down.
Yeah.
There's an aphorism for you. I like that one. Anybody else? You'll be shocked to hear I have others if you don't, but I want to make sure I make room.
Well, all that makes me think like this big divide we see. I see so broken wide open in the church, and it's about the questions that revolve around the propositional claims. I mean, Rory really said it super well. It's like, I don't believe, and then you have a list of propositions that I think most people who grew up in the church in America is like, well, yeah, you have to believe these statements as true or false, and that's just what reality is. If you don't believe that, you're not a Christian. And I see you as a pastor, and you're playing with every single day the implications of humans as an evolved creature out of the depths of history. And so what do we do, like, when the problem that we find with maybe some of these propositional claims that the church has tried to provide as this is the right answer? Science has done such a good job of like expanding like the God of the gaps arguments. Like, well, science has kind of filled these gaps that these religious story structures have filled. But when you go as far as Eric's talking about, of that deep black hole of singularity that everything falls into and turns in on itself and becomes contradictory and disappears into nothing. It's like, at a certain point, what you're talking about is like, if you're going to try to dive all the way into the propositions, there is no way out of that hole propositionally. The point of the abstract question is more supposed to get at this relational level of how do we act, not what do we believe and claim as a true or false statement, but what these abstract ideas, how do they work themselves out within a human, inside of a story, in a society, with other people, in relationship, in community. And so that's where you can see these things work well in a functioning church community. But the other problem is people are still hanging on to propositional claims that don't compute nowadays. And Peterson offered a different way to mix it up and frame the stories, which are super helpful. And they kind of do that subsuming thing with Newtonian physics inside of an Einsteinian model or something along those lines. So it's like, what do we do to move the church past this image of, well, it's a backwards, archaic religion that believes this proposition, which just looks like Ken Ham basically, and his theme park in Kentucky with Noah's Ark and all that, and Jesus on dinosaurs and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it's strange to see you as a pastor from a more theologically conservative background playing with these ideas, and it kind of strangely enough, it kind of like it cuts a certain atheist critique off like at the pass, because you're like, well, I'm playing with Darwin and all these truths that science has handed to us, the things we see, but it's like, we want to play with the truth claims as if we could get a big enough telescope to like lay our eyes upon Plato's forms or something like that. And it's really about bringing it back. I see you talking about, you keep bringing the story back down to, well, here's a story, and everybody knows the story you're telling. You're like, everybody, I'm thinking about my grandma, or I'm thinking about, I just went to her funeral. Like we're thinking about these things and trying to, it's where this abstract bloviating kind of just gets back down to like real flesh and bone. And I don't see, in some ways, I don't see, like there's that divide in the church of hanging on to these propositional claims or trying to avoid the question entirely and just and going into traditional communal things, but not really speaking to everybody that can't buy those propositions.
I like John Vervaeke's schema of 4 P's of knowing. We know things in 4 different ways. We know things propositionally, we know things perspectively, we know things procedurally, and we know things, I almost always have trouble getting all 4. We know things perspectival, propositional, procedurally, and in terms of participation. Okay, those are the 4. Those 4 P's are really knit together. And so they're almost always propositional ideas that in any sort of knowing, you can express the knowing in propositional terms. Now, what's interesting about what Rory was talking about and what you're talking about is that the church has used propositional beliefs as a boundary marker for participation. And that's not a bad boundary marker. If you are running a music club, one of the propositions that you might demand of all your participants is the belief that music is good. Because if you believe music is bad and ought to be banished from this world, and you're going into music clubs and you say, I'm going to every music club I can because I want to convince everyone that music is bad, these music clubs are going to show you the door, because whether or not they've written it on a sign, they all act like music is good. And so over time, the church has used these propositional beliefs as sort of boundary markers. And one of the things that I've noted is that they don't necessarily function in the church the way even the church says they do. Most churches will say, if you want to be a member, and what they mean by that is someone who is sort of a stakeholder and a perpetuator of the tradition and the institution, we want you to agree to these propositions. But most all churches are really happy if people who disagree with with these propositions really want to come in and participate. They'll just get a little nervous if the person who says music is bad wants to sort of climb the ranks of Note for Notes to get into the board of directors, and everybody's kind of thinking, if they really believe music is bad, Notes for Notes, whether or not we say music is good, we're all about music is good. And so if you believe music is bad, you'll have no part of us. You know, we're not going to hunt you down and burn your house down, but you're not getting on the board. And so even the way that these propositions interact with the participatory aspect of knowing amongst the group, that takes some time to sort of think through and take a look at. And again, most churches don't really know this because they've just been so enculturated to say, we're here for people who believe everything in the Apostles' Creed. And then someone comes along and says, I think Trump is the enemy, or I think Trump is God's gift to America. Suddenly they're either on the ins or on the outs, even though Trump has never been a part of their theological propositions, but they're all lining up either against him or for him. And so I see the value of the propositions as boundary markers for participation, but I think both people inside and outside the church aren't really fully understanding the bigger picture of what's really going on, because we've seen this with people like Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay, who, 10 years ago were, all of this religious belief and propositions, we got to get rid of that from the world. And now they're, talking to Calvinist pastors and all these people because the threat are these other atheists and woke, and so all this other stuff. So I see the dilemma of propositions, but in my experience over long periods of time, these things sort of usually take care of themselves. For example, the Gideons are an organization that are all about giving out Bibles. And so you'll find them in front of schools giving out Bibles and stuff. And a friend of mine in the church once thought he wanted to join the Gideons. And so there's somebody else in the Gideons. And this particular person loved being a part of a group. He always wanted to be part of a group. And he goes to the Gideons and he learns that to be a Gideon, you have to sign off on a document that says we take the lake of fire in the book of Revelation literally. And he didn't. And he was an elder in my church, and nobody ever asked him, what about this lake of fire? But the Gideons, somewhere along the line in their history, someone had this business about the lake of fire, and they wrote that into the bylaws. And probably there's lots of people in the Gideons that kind of say, lake of fire, yeah, okay, but it never comes up. And so with organization and institutions, yeah, the propositional things are always with us, whether they're sort of brought up to the top, like at the board meeting, we're going to go around the table. Is music good? Yes. Is music good? Yes. Is music good? I don't know. Heretic, and I'm going to burn them at the stake of the Hard Rock Cafe. So it's an issue, but I don't think it's the kind of issue that so often we act like it is.
For those of you who've heard the riff about Christmas Day, I'm thinking about, being the kid who didn't believe in Christmas and going around telling all the other kids at school that there was no Santa. You don't want to be that kid, But I want to take another crack at this. It's basically the supernatural verse. You've been talking about this a lot lately, because it's the same basic thing, right? Do you believe in, then fill in the blank, some sort of supernatural thing? And my take on this, it's similar to what Rory's saying, what Chris has brought up, but so it seems to me that there's something like we're all highly social creatures. We're very tuned in to frequencies that we don't necessarily realize, right? Like we're evaluating each other on a lot of different metrics, and many of them are not really known to us. But it seems to me a couple sort of big ones are something like, do you practice what you preach? Some version of, is this a double standard? Are you Are you being authentic, right? Something like that, right? And we have these ways of evaluating that are often very, very layered and subtle. And the other one is, what do you have at stake? Are you actually making meaningful sacrifices, to sort of make this sound a little Peterson-esque, right? Like, that's what virtue signaling is, right? It's like we suspect, not only does this not cost you anything to say, we actually think it's actually enhancing your reputation, right? And so it's not really virtuous at all. If anything, it might be the opposite, right? And it's not necessarily that what you're saying is wrong, it's that we suspect that you are not doing it for reasons that we would admire, right? And again, that's not often stated. It's like, yeah, what do you really have at stake here? And one of the conversations that Paul and I had early on was, I said something like, I'm interested in the truth, capital T truth, the truth, as if any of us will ever have the truth. I said, and I we didn't really know each other well enough for me to be so presumptuous, but I said, honestly, Paul, like church would be the last place I would go for the truth. Because I want to be able to ask questions and I want to be able to bring up things that make people uncomfortable. And if I can't do that, how could I ever possibly arrive at the truth? And it would seem to me that the church would be the very place I would do this. And my experience is it's the opposite. It's one of the last places I would go for this, right? And it was a point, you were actually, God bless you, you were very open to that. And we had a really generative conversation about it. But what I think is going on about this sort of supernatural thing, it's like, do you really believe that Jesus physically rose from the dead? Like, really, right? I'm not putting you on the spot. I'm just saying, like, those who are asking that question are doing something like what I just said, which is they have a sense that they know, and now I am directing at you or at pastors or at people who have high status, elders and things like that. We suspect that if you answered honestly, it would cost you. And so we don't believe you, right? So that it's not just this, because it is an institution, because it is an organization, there are dues paying members. There's some percentage of a typical church that would walk out or would stop tithing if their pastor said, well, no, actually, I don't actually believe that. It's a very useful metaphor or whatever. And I think part of what makes it, and now I'm going to speak for me personally, where I struggle with the relevance of a church is that, like, this is not such a terribly difficult question, right? It's not like I have the answer, but it doesn't bother me to ask it, right? It doesn't bother me to entertain the possibility that there might be more than one way to think about this that wouldn't in any way deconstruct my worldview, right? And so when I see people having such a hard time with something that seems so kind of basic, it makes me think, oh, that's because like 40% of their parishioners are hanging on to that and don't let them down. So anyway, I don't know to the degree to which you would want to comment on any of that, but that's another take on, I think, this question, these sort of propositional things. We're having arguments because we suspect that there's going to be some cost associated with acknowledging the validity of the question.
Well, I think that's very true, especially in terms of, let's say, horizontal cost. Okay, so if I say I don't believe Jesus rose from the dead, suddenly I'm in trouble with my credential in the Christian Reformed Church, and I can lose my employment. And fortunately, the pension, they still pay you. It doesn't matter. You can become a raging heretic in retirement, and they still give you your pension, thanks to the United States government. So there's always that. But a lot of the question has to do with how are these things, which might seem like historical categories, how are they tied to the value and decision matrices that I make in my world today? And so let's take a step away from the resurrection. Let's say walking on water. Maybe if we're out in the middle of a storm and our life depends on someone getting to the other shore, do I really believe Jesus walked on water? Well, I don't know. How about Peter walking on water? I don't know. But I sure need to walk on water now. And a lot of those supernatural things get into the question of, how am I going to spend my life now? In a lot of ways, that's where the resurrection comes in, because at least for me personally, if I imagine that the resurrection is true, and again, you get very Petersonian with this belief thing. I mean, the chattering rider on the elephant says, I believe in the resurrection. And the elephant's like, do you live that way? But if I believe in the resurrection, and to a degree, I have a difficult time believing in that if I'm not surrounded just sociologically and psychologically by a whole bunch of people who are reinforcing that belief. If I believe in that idea, suddenly I feel freer to risk my life and spend my life in ways that I might not if I think that the biological cessation of this meat sack is it. And so something that seems like some thing back in history, belief in the resurrection, yes, no, who cares? What does it mean? Well, to the degree that it connects in with me and how I live my life, should have impacts into the choices I make in what I do with my life now. And I think that's where your question of, do you believe it or not, is really key, because I think, again, part of the reason churches are places that many people don't take seriously is because churches say all these things, but they don't live as if they actually believe it. And I think that's part of the reason why Jordan Peterson got everyone's attention when he said, I'm not going to comply with government or University of Toronto things, and I don't care if it costs me my job. And if you put me in prison, I'll hunger strike. Suddenly, whether or not you agree with what he's doing, you know he's serious. And as human beings, we pay a lot of attention to that. And we might think the person is a kook or a nut, but we sort of respect them by the courage of their convictions. And right now, in terms of churches, the signal to noise is not so good for churches. And that usually changes when there's more chaos in the room and somebody stands up and says, and sometimes this happens in the opposite, they'll stand up and say, I don't believe any of this anymore, and fire me as a pastor. And then suddenly everybody's like, ooh, well, I respect that. So I think that's part of how that plays. And again, churches work very long arcs. And so it was so interesting when we had Sam come into our Discord community and our community in my little corner of the internet, and he says, I don't believe in the Trinity. And all of these people who are nice and kind and gentle to atheists suddenly took out their claws. And it's like, oh, the church built that into you for 1,500 years, and you didn't know it was in there. It's sort of like if you watch the movie Madagascar, when the lion gets hungry, you know, he starts looking to eat his friends. Stuff is built into us. And what we find is that in very old institutions, they practice things that we're not aware of. And that's why in some ways we can say the Apostles' Creed, and well, do we really believe it? Well, Jordan Peterson is right. How we choose to live our lives will demonstrate the real level of belief. So
I know that you have another obligation coming up pretty soon. Are there any other questions that we might want to try to squeeze in here?
Something I've been thinking about, and I'm not quite sure whether it leads to a clear question, but it's building off this idea of belief, I think, and where the church might believe in certain propositions. We're now seeing where, you know, probably most people have seen, people might have signs in their yard or stickers on their car that say, I believe in science. And that strikes me as very odd, because belief seems to be something that is in something that is not provable, not fact, quote unquote. And so if you believe in science, it kind of implies that science is not factual, but requires belief. So it's kind of odd to me as well. But then it also basically points out how it seems science has replaced religion for many people, how they simply just slot the idea of science in where something like the Bible and a religion would have been before, and they just put all of their belief in science. And so, but then when I listen to some scientists at a very high level where they kind of get to either the depths of science or the top of science, depending on the perspective, in quantum physics or galactic, they seem to not really have any more answers beyond a certain level. And this may get to Eric F's point about existentialism as well. And I think Chris made a comment, the black hole of singularity, that answers disappear. And I think in science, they reach that point, and it almost reaches a point of faith or religion as well. And so I'm just curious about this sense of many people replacing religion with science and a belief in a God or an afterlife with none, and yet not really having answers above or below these levels of resolution. And maybe wondering where the discourse in society and politics, I think, because a lot of it comes back to politics, but where you see that going with this sense of a belief in science. And I view it as a false polarity, I guess might be the word, or a binary, false binary of science or religion, science or the church. And I don't necessarily personally think that it needs to be a binary, and it seems that you don't view it that way. So I wonder if you have any thoughts further on that.
Well, I think you're exactly right. When you put a bumper sticker and you say, I believe in science, it's a very religious move. Now, one of the things in my recent videos, I've been talking about religion S, which is sort of a secular perspective on religion that says religion is about going to church and praying, and that there's a supernatural thing we call God. And if you relate to this God, he'll bring down miracles in your life. And so secular people look at that and say, well, that's religion. But when you put a bumper sticker on your car that says, I believe in science, and when you walk into a hospital and recognize that the hospital is full of rituals, that why are all the doctors wearing white coats? And, before the doctors, somebody made an observation of watching very traditional people employ sacrifice and all of the rituals that they had. First we walk here, then we turn here, then we raise this, then we say this, then we do this. And then they watch surgeons in an operating room. First we wash our hands, and we wash them the same way every time. And then we do this, and then we do this. And it's like, yeah, it's the same stuff. It's exaptation. I think that's the fancy Vervaeke word. It's the same practices in our brain that have the priest going through the ritual and the doctor going through the ritual, and the priest is trying to eliminate spiritual contamination, and the doctor is trying to eliminate germ contamination. In neither case can you actually see them, but they're taking it on faith that wearing these masks and doing these rituals are going to achieve a particular outcome. And sort of what we have done in science, I mean, the practice of science is to reduce variables down to tiny little cause and effect links that we can sort of build into chains and achieve outcomes. And of course, the dirty little secret for anyone who has had a particular illness where something really complex, where the doctors, well, let's try this. Well, let's try this. And you walk into that. I thought this was based on science. And so, well, yes, it is. And 40% of our patients respond to this and 30% to this. And where do I land in that matrix? Well, we don't know. And, I work, there's a homeless person that's banging on my door pretty persistently. You've probably heard him. this really comes to the fore in mental health issues, because I work with a lot of people who deal with psychiatric drugs, and to the best that I've known, the psychiatrists have a degree of things that they try, but basically, let's try this drug and let's see what that does. Now let's try this drug and say, wait, I thought we were doing science. Well, we are, but there's all these possibilities. And then you get to the point where the scientist in the white lab coat says, well, we don't have anything we can do for you, because truth be told, 100% of the patients who put themselves in our culture under medical science will die. Science has not eliminated death. And so, yeah, I don't see it as different things.
And science is the scientific method. It's inquiry, it's questions, it's investigation. In other words, it's the opposite of answers in a sense. Even if you have answers, you keep interrogating them, right?
Yeah.
So in a sense, what they're saying is, I believe in answers.
Yeah.
And that sounds a lot like church.
Yeah. There's a lot of science smuggling going on in our culture.
Yeah. So we'll be sensitive to your schedule, Paul. I know are you up against
no, not really.
Here?
He bangs on my door multiple
Okay.
times a day. If it's really urgent, he'll yell at me.
Yeah, you just let us know to give me enough time so I can give you a proper thank you.
Yeah, I should be out of here by 7. So
okay, and we the rest of us can keep going for a while longer if we have more. At least if we just want to talk about you, Paul.
Make sure to record that so I can find out what all you said.
Yeah, that's actually, we'll stop recording. Yuri, we haven't heard from you. Did you want to chime in?
Not really. I had been learning quite a bit for this conversation. So no, I'm enjoying the conversation. That's at this point, that's where I am. So.
Understood. Yeah, understood. Representing the Catholics, you and Eric representing Catholics on this call.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Because I got more, but
I have one more.
Sure.
One more thing, and it's not necessarily like a question. Short question. Are you familiar with the philosopher theologian Peter Rollins at all, Paul?
Tiny little bit. One of the guys that I talked to is more familiar with him, so his name comes up. I've seen a couple of his videos.
Okay. You haven't done any like commentary on his videos? I haven't seen that come across your channel.
No.
Well, I'm sure there's no shortage of things you're interested in, but if you're looking at your computer and bored one day, I would love to hear some thoughts on Peter Rollins. Like the term, I don't remember who said it, but the term like God of the gaps came up once or twice tonight. And I think Peter Rollins would say God as gap. It's just like this subtle change, and reminded me when Eric F. was talking about bearing your cross, and his reading of the crucifixion is the moment Jesus became an atheist. My God, why have you forsaken me? And like this is salvation. Like it's a very subversive reading of the gospel. And his project is called pyrotheology. There's a sense of burning it down or refining it by fire. But I think I've loved digging into his stuff. Didn't know if you were familiar or if any of his content would interest a future video. So
I very well might come across it. Probably will depend on if he's linked up with people or commentary that I have been doing. The God of the gaps thing is interesting, and I have my own metaphor for this, which is if you think about the God of the gaps, let's say as you're trying to construct a jigsaw puzzle on a table. And so historically, often the God of the gaps has been, we sort of figure out, well, atmospheric pressure moves clouds and that moves weather. And so now, we don't think that God moves the weather, or tectonic plates moves earthquakes and volcanoes and tsunamis. So we don't think that God does that. That's sort of like putting puzzle pieces on, and then we say God in the places where we haven't found a piece that sort of fits in. But I think it's best off imagining God to be the table underneath, because you've sort of covered up God with some science, but it's going to go down below it, because you might say that, well, the tsunami happened because of tectonic plates. Okay, but that's, you get back into the Aristotelian causes. That's not the final cause. That's the instrumental cause. You haven't really asked, why did the earthquake happen that caused the tsunami that wiped out Lisbon in the 17th century and caused a meaning crisis for a whole bunch of Christians in Europe, in some ways launching the Enlightenment. So there's a lot to that God of the gaps thing, and it's a worthwhile metaphor to explore.
So I'll take one more. Sometimes I've used this analogy. I call it cheating at solitaire. You know, like I remember when computers first came out and there weren't that many things you could do on them. I remember the solitaire game was one of the first things, like, oh, I could just kill hours playing solitaire, right? And one of the things about doing it on a computer is it made it harder to cheat, because it was like, you know, only let you go through the deck 3 times, whatever, right? But if you're playing solitaire the old-fashioned way, you just kind of peek, and like it makes the game more fun. You know, you're winning, right? And I mean, it's just more fun to win than not win, or even if it's just to win a little more often, right? Problem is, you know, it's just like setting your clock fast by 5 minutes so you're never late. Well, you know, it's 5 minutes fast, and pretty soon you're just late anyway. You know you're cheating, right? So it ends up not being all that satisfying to know, yeah, I'm winning, but I'm cheating. So it's like, that doesn't feel so good, right? And it seems to me that this is kind of a dilemma of the sort of postmodern era, right? Is that we've gotten to the point where we kind of see every move we make, or if we don't see it, someone else will point it out, you know, or we'll see someone say something about it on YouTube, and then we realize, oh yeah, we do that too, or whatever, right? We've all become so painfully self-aware that we have a hard time believing even the things that we think we believe. And so I guess the question I'm asking is, you know, we've heard the phrase that we are made in God's image, but could it just as easily be said that he has been made in our image?
That's been said many times. God made us in his image, and we return the favor. Yeah, sure. And it's a very fruitful thought, because I mean, that was sort of Freud's debunking, but it doesn't answer the question. Why are we this way to begin with? Why are we masters of this world in such a, well, we're the most evolved hominids, and we destroyed the competitors. Well, why did we win? Who is us? So, yeah.
I love the idea of treating this as a deep mystery, the deepest mystery of all. And the idea that this is the best we can do to come to explain something that we can't explain, and that these stories just help us because our brains are limited. I love that idea. Like that's something that to me actually makes it so much richer and so much more meaningful, because the mystery itself is what is so profound, right? And that's why I am allergic to answers, you know, because it's like, no, you're flattening the mystery. You're reducing it to something that is trite.
Yeah. I think that's the heart. So Eric Weinstein has this term, Jesus smuggling. And I first thought it was just that you talk to a Christian long enough and Jesus is going to come into the conversation. That's not really it. The idea is you talk to a Christian long enough and Jesus is going to be the pat answer. And the Christian himself or herself just sort of knows to, you know, instead of having the puzzle piece that fits the whole, it's like they throw a Jesus card over that part of the map and say, here's the card, it's covering up the hole. And it's like, yeah, no, you haven't shown me how Jesus really answers that. You just covered up the hole.
Well, is this a good time to land the plane, everyone? Paul, thank you so much. Thank you for all the work you've been doing. You've been an inspiration to me and to this project and to those of us who keep having these conversations. And you're setting a remarkable example, a very unique and remarkable example. It's an inspiring example. You certainly have restored some of my respect for your vocation. And so we really appreciate you taking this much time to answer our questions. Everybody on this call, if you haven't, check out his videos on YouTube. Just Paul VanderKlay. He has a Patreon. Support him. Of the dozen people or so that are watching this and have gotten to this end, it's not going to help you much, Paul. But I hope that the people support your work because I think it's important. We really appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you, Rod. It was a pleasure being with you all, and happy to do it again sometime. I really want to see Rod's project flourish, and I think it's very much in alignment with my estuary idea. So I want to see. I don't know, Rod's got his schemes, but I really believe in him, and I want to see him successful in this, just like he's been successful with Notes for Notes and other things. So I'm excited to see where it goes.
Yeah, Paul, please pray for our pastor Rod.
I deserve
We're going to give you vestments before you know it.
All right. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks,
All right.
Paul.
We'll carry on. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.